There was a time when Veronica Lake wasn't just a name, she was a phenomenon. In the 1940s, she was the woman every American GI carried in their pocket, her face printed on pinup photos, her silky blonde hair falling in a curtain over one eye. Hollywood labeled her the peekaboo girl, and for a few shining years, she was one of the brightest stars in the Golden Age firmament. But just as quickly as she rose, she disappeared. What happened to Veronica Lake? How does someone go from being a national obsession, a style icon whose hairstyle was banned in wartime factories because it posed a safety hazard, to tending bar in New York, ignored by the same world that once worshipped her? The story of Veronica Lake is not just about a glamorous Hollywood starlet. It's about how the industry chews people up and spits them out, how fame can vanish in an instant, and how behind the shimmering posters of old Hollywood lay heartbreak, disillusionment, and decline. Lake's career took off in the early 1940s with films like This Gun for Hire and The Glass Key. She starred opposite Alan Ladd in a string of noir classics, their on-screen chemistry electrifying audiences. She was beautiful, mysterious, and instantly recognizable. She had the face of a goddess, but she also had a reputation, and not the kind studios wanted to publicize. By her early 30s, Lake's career was in free fall. She had been called difficult, plagued by rumors of alcoholism, clashes with directors, and failed marriages. The industry moved on without her, and the woman who had once defined an era was left stranded, struggling to find her place outside the studio lights. And then, as if she had never existed, Veronica Lake vanished from Hollywood. No farewell tour, no carefully staged press release. One day she was on the silver screen, the next she was gone. But here's the unsettling truth. Her disappearance wasn't sudden at all. It was the slow unraveling of a woman trapped by the very image that made her famous. A decline hidden behind closed doors until she re-emerged years later, in the most unlikely of places. In this story, we'll uncover what really happened to Veronica Lake, her meteoric rise, the scandals and struggles that derailed her career, and the haunting, lonely years that followed. This isn't just the tale of a Hollywood starlet. It's the story of what happens when the spotlight burns too bright and the world looks away the moment the light fades. Stay with us, because the truth of Veronica Lake's vanishing act is far more dramatic and tragic than the public ever knew. Before she became the peekaboo girl, Veronica Lake was simply Constance Frances Marie Ockelman, a restless young woman from Brooklyn. Her father, an oilman, died when she was a child, and her mother remarried. By all accounts, she was shy, intelligent, and oddly aloof, but she had one asset that Hollywood could not ignore: her face. High cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, and hair so blonde it seemed lit from within. When her family relocated to Miami, then Los Angeles, she began taking acting classes. She had no Hollywood connections, no famous parents to open doors for her. She was just another girl chasing dreams under the California sun. And yet, in an industry that thrived on turning ordinary women into goddesses, Lake stood out. Paramount Pictures soon signed her, reshaping Constance Ockelman into Veronica Lake, a name that sounded like a mystery waiting to be solved. Her breakthrough came in 1941 with I Wanted Wings. Although she wasn't the lead, audiences couldn't take their eyes off her. There was something hypnotic about the way her hair fell across one eye, partly by accident, partly by design. That hairstyle, the peekaboo bang, became an overnight sensation. By 1942, Veronica Lake was everywhere. Her films with Alan Ladd, This Gun for Hire, The Glass Key, and The Blue Dahlia cemented her as a film noir siren. Ladd was short, Lake was petite, and together they created an intoxicating screen duo. They were cool, dangerous, and unforgettable. But Lake's influence wasn't confined to movie theaters. Her hairstyle, copied by millions of women, became a cultural phenomenon. So popular, in fact, that the U.S. government intervened during World War II. Factory workers imitating Lake's peekaboo look were getting their hair caught in machinery. Newspapers reported injuries, and even the War Production Board stepped in, urging Lake to change her hairstyle for the sake of national safety. In a rare patriotic gesture, she appeared in public with her hair pulled back, declaring it was every woman's duty to work safely. That was how powerful she was. One Hollywood starlet could alter the habits of a nation at war. Yet with every rise comes the seeds of decline. Even in her early successes, there were whispers. Lake was aloof, difficult, unreliable. Some directors complained she was hard to work with, prone to lateness, distracted, or simply indifferent. While the studio polished her image into Hollywood perfection, behind the scenes cracks were beginning to show. Still, in those first few years, none of that mattered. To the public, Veronica Lake was untouchable. The woman on every magazine cover, the star whose very presence made a movie ticket worth buying. She was proof that Hollywood could transform anyone into royalty, a living dream flickering in black and white. But dreams fade quickly in Hollywood. By the end of the 1940s, the same hairstyle that had made her a sensation began to look dated. New faces were arriving, younger, fresher, more malleable to studio demands. And the rumors about her temperament weren't going away. The stage was set for a fall, and for Veronica Lake, that fall would be as dramatic as her rise. The world had crowned her an icon almost overnight. But what the world gives, Hollywood takes away even faster. And in Lake's case, the glamour was about to give way to something much darker. Hollywood has always thrived on illusions. But for Veronica Lake, the illusion couldn't hold forever. Behind the sultry glance, the perfectly coiffed hair, and the polished studio publicity machine, she was battling forces both personal and professional that would eventually consume her career. The whispers began early. Even in her breakout years, directors and co-stars noticed something about Veronica that was difficult to manage. Some called her aloof, others labeled her unreliable. A few simply thought she was bored. Paramount executives tried to spin it, suggesting she was mysterious, enigmatic, even unreachable. But what Hollywood marketed as allure, directors saw as indifference. Alan Ladd, her frequent co-star, famously had a complicated relationship with her. On screen, they were dynamite. Two small figures radiating enormous charisma, perfectly matched in moody noirs. Off-screen, however, he found her cold and frustrating. Ladd once remarked that she had trouble acting like a human being. It wasn't that she lacked talent. Critics often praised her screen presence. But she had little interest in playing Hollywood's off-screen game. She avoided studio parties, shunned the gossip columnists, and kept herself apart. For an industry built on charm and publicity, this was almost unforgivable. Then came her personal life. Veronica married young, at just 19, to art director John Detley. The marriage was rocky, plagued by arguments and absences. Lake's stardom only worsened the strain. She gave birth to her first child during the marriage, but the pressures of Hollywood, combined with her restless temperament, proved too much. The union ended in divorce in 1943. She remarried quickly, this time to director André de Todt. The marriage was passionate but volatile, producing 3 more children and endless drama. Friends recalled violent arguments, infidelity, and financial troubles. The studio machine, desperate to maintain her image as a glamorous starlet, tried to suppress the details. But within Hollywood circles, her reputation as trouble was becoming impossible to ignore. Alcohol was another shadow creeping into her life. By the mid-1940s, rumors of heavy drinking began to surface. She appeared at parties disheveled, her sharp wit turning cutting, even cruel after a few cocktails. Directors whispered that she showed up late to sets, unprepared, or sometimes simply refused to come at all. Paramount executives tried to rein her in, but Veronica was resistant. She didn't play by the rules. Some said she was stubborn, others said she was self-destructive. World War II had been her golden moment, with her image plastered across barracks and battleships. But as the war ended, so too did the demand for Veronica Lake. Her iconic hairstyle suddenly felt outdated. New stars were on the rise. Rita Hayworth, Lauren Bacall, Ava Gardner, women who embodied a different kind of glamour. Hollywood is merciless to those who cannot adapt, and Veronica seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to reinvent herself. By the late 1940s, her box office power was waning. Films that once guaranteed success now flopped. Paramount quietly released her from her contract. For a star who had defined an era, It was a brutal come-down. Her personal life unraveled alongside her career. Divorce from de Toth came in 1952, leaving her financially and emotionally strained. Legal battles over custody and child support left scars. Veronica, once photographed in dazzling gowns on red carpets, was now spotted in courtrooms, looking weary and disillusioned. The press, always eager to build someone up only to tear them down, relished in her decline. Headlines shifted from celebrating her beauty to mocking her struggles. One tabloid referred to her as a cautionary tale of Hollywood's cruelty. Another cruelly dubbed her the peekaboo has-been. But the truth was more complicated than gossip columns suggested. Veronica Lake was not simply a victim of her own flaws. She was also a casualty of the studio system itself. Paramount had created the Veronica Lake persona, complete with the hairstyle, the sultry roles, and the image of icy allure. But when that image no longer sold tickets, they abandoned her. What they had built, they had also destroyed, leaving the real woman, Constance Ockelman, stranded without a compass. And here lies the tragedy. Veronica Lake wasn't gone yet, but Hollywood was already treating her like a ghost. Her star power had faded, her marriages had crumbled, and her reputation was tarnished. For most actresses, this would be the beginning of a quiet retirement, a graceful exit from the spotlight. But for Veronica Lake, the fall was just beginning. What came next was not just a decline in roles, but a descent into obscurity so profound it would shock those who had once idolized her. Because while the public assumed she had simply vanished, the truth was far more unsettling. Veronica Lake would resurface, but not as the starlet the world remembered. By the early 1950s, Veronica Lake's glittering stardom had dimmed to a faint glow. Hollywood had no more use for her, and the woman once hailed as the embodiment of allure found herself adrift. The descent was neither quick nor graceful. It was slow, humiliating, and marked by choices that seemed almost unimaginable for someone who had once been America's sweetheart. After her divorce from Andre de Toth in 1952, Veronica's life unraveled further. She had lost her Paramount contract, her marriage, and much of her fortune. Lawsuits and custody battles drained her finances, while her drinking worsened. Stories circulated of her staggering through hotel lobbies, refusing to pay bills, or being forcibly evicted for failing to cover rent. For someone who had once commanded the silver screen, the image of Veronica Lake struggling to find money for shelter was both heartbreaking and surreal. She attempted to revive her career, taking small parts in low-budget films and stage plays, but the magic was gone. Her once iconic hairstyle seemed hopelessly dated, her star image out of sync with the glamour Hollywood now demanded. Casting directors didn't call anymore, and when they did, it was often for roles that felt more like mockery than opportunity. By the mid-1950s, Veronica Lake had become a cautionary tale whispered among Hollywood hopefuls. And then, almost as suddenly as she had risen to fame, she disappeared. Where did she go? The answer shocked those who eventually found out. In the early 1960s, the legendary Veronica Lake was discovered working as a cocktail waitress and bartender at a small establishment in New York City. Gone were the gowns, the red carpets, the flashing bulbs of photographers. She stood behind a bar in a modest uniform, serving drinks to patrons who often didn't recognize her. Or if they did, weren't sure it was really her. When word got out, the press pounced. A once revered Hollywood goddess reduced to pouring beer and mixing cocktails? It was the kind of fallen angel narrative tabloids loved. But to those who met her then, there was something hauntingly dignified about Veronica Lake. She admitted openly who she was, sometimes joking with customers about her Hollywood past, other times shrugging it off entirely. She seemed resigned to her fate. In interviews, she later admitted that she chose bartending because it provided steady work and a measure of anonymity. It was honest, she said. It was real. But behind her words lingered bitterness. She knew Hollywood had discarded her, and she had no illusions of ever regaining her former glory. Her struggles were not only financial, her health suffered under the weight of alcoholism. Friends reported that she was often frail, withered compared to the bombshell the world once knew. At times, she was homeless, moving between cheap hotels or sleeping wherever she could find a bed. The woman whose face had once been projected 20 feet high on silver screens across America now lived as a drifter in her own country. And yet, even in this state, she retained flashes of wit, intelligence, and defiance. Patrons who spoke with her recalled a sharp tongue and a keen sense of humor. She may have been battered by life, but she was not broken. In 1962, she attempted an unlikely comeback, publishing an autobiography titled Veronica. The Autobiography of Veronica Lake. The book was candid, pulling back the curtain on Hollywood's cruelties and her own mistakes. It garnered attention, but not enough to reignite her career. Studios had already moved on, and audiences, captivated by the new wave of stars, had little appetite for nostalgia. Still, her vanishing act remained a source of fascination. How could someone once so luminous fade so completely into obscurity? The truth was that Hollywood had little use for women who aged, who rebelled, or who refused to bend entirely to its rules. Veronica Lake had been all three. By the late 1960s, she drifted again, moving between New York, Miami, and even England. She performed sporadically in stage productions and television appearances, but they were fleeting, reminders of what had been rather than promises of what could still be. Each attempt at revival felt more desperate, more tragic, and then, just as she had once disappeared from Hollywood, she began to vanish from public consciousness altogether. The starlet whose hairstyle once shaped a nation's fashion now walked past strangers unnoticed. The story was almost too cruel to believe. A goddess reduced to anonymity, a woman erased by the very industry that created her. But her disappearance from Hollywood wasn't the end of her story. In fact, the most heartbreaking chapter was still to come. Because Veronica Lake would face not just obscurity, but illness, poverty, and ultimately a lonely death far from the spotlight that had once defined her. Her life had become a grim parable. Fame is fleeting, Hollywood is unforgiving, and even the brightest star can fade into darkness. By the late 1960s, Veronica Lake was a shadow of the starlet who once defined 1940s glamour. The peekaboo girl, who had graced magazine covers and inspired millions, now lived a restless, transient existence, moving from place to place, chasing work, and rarely finding stability. It was a cruel fate for someone who had once seemed untouchable. Her attempts at comebacks never stuck. Stage productions in small theaters, a handful of television appearances, even a few roles in low-budget European films. None of it restored her to the Hollywood pantheon. The public, when they noticed her at all, saw her as a relic of a bygone era. One critic cruelly remarked that she looked like a ghost of herself. The industry had moved on to new icons: Marilyn Monroe, Sophia Loren, Elizabeth Taylor, and Veronica Lake had no place in that shifting landscape. What she did have was poverty. Despite earning significant sums during her peak years, she had little to show for it. Bad investments, legal disputes, and medical bills drained her finances. By the 1970s, Lake was again living in cheap hotels, often unable to pay her rent. She was spotted at times in Miami, at others in New York, her once glamorous life reduced to drifting between low-income accommodations. Alcohol remained her constant companion. Decades of heavy drinking had taken a devastating toll on her body. Friends recalled her looking gaunt, her once radiant blonde hair dull and brittle. The sharp cheekbones that had once photographed like marble now revealed the hollow signs of malnutrition. At 4'11", her petite frame made her frailty all the more visible. Yet Veronica Lake was never one to fully surrender. In 1970, she surprised the public with the release of her autobiography, Veronica. The book was both confessional and defiant, offering a candid look at Hollywood's studio system and her own personal battles. She did not shy away from her drinking, her failed marriages, or her fall from grace. Instead, she embraced them as part of her story. The book received moderate attention, briefly pulling her back into the public eye, but it did not translate into lasting financial security. In her final years, she lived much as she had in her middle decline, modestly, privately, and often alone. She occasionally worked on stage, including a modest run in off-Broadway productions, but these projects provided little money. She also lived for a time in England, hoping a change of scenery might bring new opportunities. but those opportunities never materialized. By the early 1970s, her health was collapsing. Years of alcoholism had ravaged her liver, leading to cirrhosis. She also developed kidney failure and hepatitis. Hospital visits became frequent, and her once commanding presence dwindled into a frail figure, barely recognizable from her Hollywood heyday. In 1973, while staying in Vermont with a friend, her condition worsened. She was admitted to a hospital in Burlington, where doctors fought to treat her failing organs. There was no Hollywood entourage, no flood of studio executives, no flashing cameras outside the hospital doors. Veronica Lake lay in her bed largely alone, far from the red carpets and premieres where she had once been the center of attention. On July 7, 1973, Veronica Lake died at just 50 years old. The official cause, acute hepatitis and acute kidney injury, both complications of her long battle with alcoholism. Her passing made brief headlines, but there was no grand memorial, no star-studded funeral. For many fans, the news was a shock. They hadn't even realized she was still alive. For others, it was the first time they had thought of her in years. In a final twist that seemed cruelly poetic, her remains were initially cremated and left unclaimed. For a time, her ashes sat in a New York funeral home, until eventually they were scattered in the waters off Miami, a city she had drifted through during her restless later years. The woman who had once captivated millions left the world quietly, almost anonymously, like the vanishing act her life had become. And yet her influence lingers. The peekaboo hairstyle she accidentally created remains iconic, referenced in fashion and film long after her death. Actresses from Jessica Rabbit to Kim Basinger in L.A. Confidential owe a debt to her noir mystique. Veronica Lake may have died in obscurity, but the image Hollywood created endures. Her story is a haunting reminder of fame's fragility. Hollywood crowned her, worshipped her, and then cast her aside. Veronica Lake lived the dream, then endured the nightmare. And in the end, she paid the price. But the question remains, was Veronica Lake simply a victim of her own demons, or of a system that builds women up only to tear them down? Perhaps the truth is both. What cannot be denied is that she vanished from the screen, from the spotlight, from the world's memory, long before her body ever left this earth. Veronica Lake's story is more than the tale of one woman's fall from grace. It is the story of Hollywood itself. She was created by the studio system, sculpted into a glamorous icon, worshipped for her beauty, and discarded the moment she no longer fit the mold. Her vanishing act was not a mystery. It was the inevitable result of a machine that prizes youth, obedience, and marketability above all else. For a brief, blinding moment in the 1940s, she was everywhere. Her face sold tickets, inspired hairstyles, and graced magazine covers. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the biggest stars of her time, sharing the screen with Alan Ladd, shaping the look and feel of film noir. But as quickly as she rose, she was erased, replaced by the next fresh face, written off as difficult, her personal struggles weaponized against her. And yet, Veronica Lake's legacy endures in subtle but undeniable ways. Her peekaboo hairstyle remains one of the most iconic images of the Golden Age, recreated in films, fashion shows, and even animated characters decades later. The sultry femme fatale archetype owes as much to Lake as to any of her contemporaries. She proved that a woman under 5 feet tall could dominate the screen, that charisma and mystique could outweigh stature or convention. But perhaps her greatest legacy lies not in her image, but in her cautionary tale. Veronica Lake's life is a reminder of how thin the line is between adoration and abandonment, between stardom and obscurity. Fame, as intoxicating as it may be, is fragile, and when the spotlight fades, few in Hollywood stay behind to catch those who fall. Her story raises difficult questions. How many other stars, especially women, were discarded the moment they became inconvenient? How many were written off as troubled when in truth they were simply human, flawed, vulnerable, and unable to live up to the impossible standards placed upon them? And in today's world of instant celebrity and social media fame, how many more Veronicas are being created and forgotten before our very eyes? For Veronica Lake, the end was quiet. There was no grand farewell, no final curtain call. But perhaps that makes her story all the more haunting, because in her disappearance, she exposed the truth that Hollywood would rather keep hidden, that the dream it sells so brightly often comes with a devastating price. So the next time you see a photograph of Veronica Lake, the hair falling across one eye, the smoldering gaze, the promise of mystery, remember what came after. Remember that behind the glamour was a woman who vanished, not because she wanted to, but because the world stopped looking. And perhaps ask yourself, if Hollywood could forget Veronica Lake, who else will it erase next?